send his regrets. He wasn't able to come. He had a family thing happen. So anyway, I'm glad I have a chance to introduce Steve. He's been my student for ever since he came to BU, which is about 100 million years ago, I believe. He's a completely different person now than he was then. Much smaller. And Steve, when Steve first came here, I really was keen to have him come because he was able to do other things that many anthropology students can't do, which is he can do all the textual work as well. It's very unusual for anthropology students, and he also has the anthropology background. So he's been working for some years with the ISB here in Boston, and his degree, which he's very close to getting, will be in anthropology and Islamic studies. So you're going to hear some of the work that he did for his dissertation. I'll let him talk about that, but I should maybe mention, I suppose all of you know what the ISB is Islamic, what is it?
Society of Boston.
Society of Boston, yeah, and it's a very large group of mostly people who come out of school. It's an intellectual kind of background, scholars, students, and so forth, and very much cross-cultural, lots of people from different backgrounds in the ISB, and there's been a lot of controversy about that as well because of the changes in developing the mosque and resistance to that and so forth. So Steve has been lucky in a way to be at a place where there's a lot of different, how should I put it, different conflicts within the community and against the external community, and this then leads to development, fairly interesting debates and development within the ISB itself. And he's been doing this research using a variety of different methods. He's been looking at doing participant observation. He's been going to the mosque, paying attention, going to classes and things like that. He's managed to convince people to speak to him.
Somehow.
Yeah, I don't know. He said that he had, I think he wrote me a note that he had progressed from being a threat to just an irritation. Big progress on the part of Steve. He's done a lot of review of the literature, the media, of the newspaper accounts and so on about the ISB and the controversies that surround it, and surveys and so forth. He's tried to bring together many, many different modes of approach to develop this thesis, which I think is going to be a very, very unusual one, and one that's going to give us new insight into the way that Islam is developing in this very complex cross-cultural environment among people who are Americans, Muslims, intellectuals, youth, and so forth, and all trying to reconcile those different identities in one place. And so he's going to just talk about one aspect of that today, so let's see.
Okay, excellent. Well, hello everyone. Professor Lindholm gave me an excellent introduction. Just to start off today, you talked about myself pretty much. So my thesis topic is Islamic identity in the Islamic Society of Boston. And what's important to note is that I wanted my work to be written as an ethnography. Because when we talk about ethnographies of American Muslims, believe it or not, there's very, very few of them, especially book-length ethnography. So this is something I wanted to concentrate on. He talked about a lot of my methodologies, but one of the things that I found the most useful was the extended interview format, which I would do 2, sometimes even 3 or more hour interviews with my informants. And I found this to be extremely useful. As they say, you get a lot of information that you normally don't from just a sociological type survey or even participant observation. People are more apt to speak their minds. Just a quick methodological note on that. A lot of people you find in the literature, such as Haddad and Loomis, they talk about the importance of Muslim researchers because they say, well, these communities are closed and it'll expedite things if we have Muslim researchers that can go into the mosques. I found in my work that I wouldn't say it's the opposite, but having a Muslim researcher isn't any panacea. Because when you have a Muslim researcher that goes into a Muslim community, as opposed to someone like me, who's clearly an outsider, you have issues brought up such as sectarian issues. You see this in the literature, interethnic issues. They say, well, are you here to recruit for this mosque? Are you here to recruit for this group? And I think sometimes, I think we all know this from our own experiences, I'm not saying that this gives me a privileged perspective, certainly, but a different perspective, because there's things that we will tell strangers that we won't tell our friends, and we won't tell our family, and ways we'll talk about things that we won't necessarily do with people that we're in contact every day. Two of the main theoretical sources that I'm using in my work that I found extremely useful as theorists was Max Weber, especially his Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism, because something that I think is happening with Islamic revivalism, in the course of my dissertation I write about this, and you'll hear me come back and back again to this theme today, is an issue of class, and the issue of class change and class ascendancy, both in the Middle East and for Muslims as academics and professionals in the United States. A very close tie between the two. And I find, it might seem like a simplistic analogy or application, but I find that a lot of what Weber wrote about the early Protestant proto-capitalists directly applies, in my view, to what we see among many of these academic, these new or professional new middle-class Muslims today. Also Pierre Bourdieu, I found his concepts of doxin, heterodoxy especially useful, the habitus, and especially body hexis, because we talk a lot, when we talk about the hijab, it's something that is embodied. It has to do with your body. So I turn to Bourdieu as a theorist who really addresses this issue. So, first of all, the talk's titled Sex Work in the Hijab, Islamic Ideals, American Realities. Well, I put the word sex in there because I figured that I'd get people to read it. You know? But there is a lot of importance to those two things that I'm saying, because primarily, people think of the hijab as a sex and gender issue, and that's important. But there's also a real economic, status, and educational issue that's important as well, or complex of issues, I should say. And I'm going to touch on both of those. So, just to give a brief description, you know, why the hijab? Why did I pick this topic? Or why is this topic salient in general? First thing it raises, obviously, is the topic, most obviously, as we say, of sex and gender. Now, Islam is a legalistic religion. It has a body of religious law, obviously known as the Sharia. However, especially in modern forms of Islamic revival, you see a holistic approach. Time and time again, you literally see the word. Islam is holistic. Islam pertains to everything in your life. So, we don't have this situation where in Christ there is no male and female. We have a situation where, almost sort of a realpolitik, where there's assumed to be natural sex differences, there's assumed to be innate sex differences, and there's also assumed to be appropriate roles for men and women, and these are part of the religion. Now at the same time, for both Muslims in diaspora and Muslims in Arab countries and in Muslim Middle Eastern countries, we have the effects of the ongoing sexual revolution. Something that came up to me talking with my interviewees and in the literature itself, and when I was writing my dissertation, is that Americans have a very short memory. I think, speaking of, you know, Americans, insofar as we can speak of a collective whole, we see things on the TV every night on primetime television that would be mind-blowingly shocking to only people from 2 or 3 generations ago. And I don't think we realize the impact of that. But that's another reason that the issues of sex and gender for the Islamists in the modern world, or the modernizing world, becomes relevant. Another important aspect. This is a theme I heard repeated from my interviewees time and time again. Islam versus culture. All right? So people are in a new situation, people in diaspora, people with new access to resources, new access to original text. They have this question, as one of my interviewees said, actually several of my interviewees literally said word for word, what is Islam and what is culture? What is just Pakistani culture or Egyptian culture or Gulf state culture, and what is the real Islam? This is an issue that a lot of these people are confronting day to day. We see this come up in terms of the hijab. Another reason it's such an important issue is because the hijab and associated forms of Islamic dress are so closely tied in to tensions that occur when the distinction between Islam and culture is made. Another one sounds similar, not quite the same thing. Religion versus tradition. Another constant theme I had. As one of my interviewees stated, For many, and they meant this in a negative way, they said for many Islam is a hand-me-down thing. It's something you inherit. You know, it's what you do on a holiday. It's just something passed down from generation to generation. And for young Muslims, especially young Muslims in the West, and especially I found those who emigrate during their adolescence, this becomes a crucial issue. One of the presidents of ISNA recently said, well actually maybe a decade ago, he said, we have to realize that we can't try to raise an Egyptian kid in the United States. If we do, all we're going to end up with is a screwed up Egyptian kid. We're not going to end up with an Egyptian kid if we try to raise an Egyptian kid in the United States. There's also been many studies done that surprisingly enough show that those who have emigrated during the period of their adolescence from any country, whether it's Korea, the Middle East, have actually a much higher rate of mental illness. And I think that says some significant things about that period in their life. So with religion versus tradition, we have people who find whether they should, you know, on one hand they have these ethnic goals of being, you know, a real Pakistani or a real Egyptian, and they're basically unattainable. So it then becomes for them the issue of finding a rationalizing view of religion that they can use in their life. All right? So there was a couple of other themes that come up. For example, community divisions. In my particular study, something that I, you know, being rather literate on this subject, wasn't totally aware of before, you have the Salafi versus Ikhwani divide. Muslims, such as the Muslims at the ISB, are heavily informed by the ideals of the Ikhwani, the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. But you have sort of a contention between them and the Salafis, and you know, in the popular press called Wahhabi Muslims, who have a much more radical, strict textualist expectations of Islam. That comes up constantly with the hijab, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So, finally, one more thing, another theme that you're going to hear me talk about: fossilization versus creativity. Barbara Metcalf, the anthropologist, in her Introduction to Making Muslim Space, talks about how we can't just assume that the practices of Muslims in diaspora are the fossilized remnants of practices from the old world. You know, in other words, these aren't simply practices brought over from the old culture and we're measuring how closely they adhere to them or how much they differ from them. There's actually real creative adaptations going on. In the context of my dissertation, I talk about marriage patterns, new marriage patterns that are occurring. But in the context of the hijab, as we're about to see, there's also a creative emphasis that's taking place there as well, where it's not something merely passed down. In terms of specific studies, we have what's called the immigrant community. Kathleen Moore in particular criticizes these studies, where someone says, okay, I'm going to go study the immigrant community of so-and-so, which consists only of Somalians. Basically, to make a long story short, for some anthropologists who study Muslims in the diaspora, the concept of the immigrant community has replaced that old anthropological trope of the Stone Age tribe. So in other words, oh, these people are isolated, it's a homogeneous culture, we can go there and we can see all the patterns and interactions fit into this unified whole, when you really can. You know, back in the 1970s, we have studies of Arab communities. You know, Dearborn, everyone goes and works at the same factory, everyone comes home at night to live in the same area of town. Well, if you're a taxi driver, if you're working at Walmart, if you're an engineer, if you're a dentist, the way housing prices are around Boston, we don't have, although they still exist, especially in my research with the ISB, you don't have that sort of compact community, that immigrant community that you can speak of as bounded. So that's where more challenges come in. Now, specifically getting on to the hijab, Benedict Anderson wrote a very important book called Imagine Communities, in which he talked about how the rise of print media led people to conceive of themselves in terms of nations. Well, I found the concept useful in reverse, speaking of unimagined communities. Yvonne Haddad wrote a book called Muslim Minorities, Visible and Invisible. And what happens is that for many Americans, let's say native-born Americans, Muslims don't exist in their practical day-to-day consciousness. They might go to a store that's run by a Muslim. They might even go to a Muslim doctor, a Muslim dentist. They might live on the same street. But in their consciousness, they do not exist with a corporate identity. So when we see a group like the ISB tries to build a mosque, or in the case of hijab, when someone sees a woman wearing this dress, it's sudden visibility that occurs. And it's not an overstatement to say that it's an eruption of this difference or this foreign or this exoticness, all those assumptions the person has into their consciousness. So, to start off a little more specifically, when I first went to research the issue of the hijab in the context of my literature, I found some interesting discrepancies, and I found, as with so many things with American Muslims, that it's really hard to pin down statistics one way or another. In 1987, in their book Islamic Values, which pretty much is still the landmark study of American Muslims, Haddad Loomis state that, referring to the hijab and Islamic dress, few if any Muslims born in the United States dress in this fashion. Most immigrants who come wearing it gradually change to more typically American-style clothing. In the course of my research, I thought that this statement was no longer fully accurate. And I ascribe that mainly to the passage of time. But you also have books and people like the popular, non-academic, popular author Asma Hassan, who says, quote, that most American Muslim women do not cover their heads. So here we are still almost 20 years later, and it's still saying that this doesn't happen, that this isn't really a big phenomenon. So I was interested in finding out more about that. First thing you can say with the change between my impression, which is that it's more than few if any, is that the passage of time. You know, we'll talk about in a few seconds about those factors involved in events in the passage of time that have led to increased adherence to the hijab. Another factor, though, is I tend to think that on the part of the researchers, there may exist an unconscious tendency to perhaps influence their estimates one way or another. So if you say, okay, Steve, you know, you're saying these researchers are underestimating the hijab, for example, because they're non-hijabis themselves, or because they're secularized Muslims. Why? What's the evidence? Well, there's some interesting evidence. Kambiz Ghania Basiri, his 1997 study of Muslims in California, he got 35.6 female respondents who said they wore the hijab daily. It was a very expansive study that went through different Shia, Sunni groups, Ismaili, many different groups. Then we have a Hamilton College study from 2001. Excuse me, the Ghania Basiri was 36%. 2001, we have a Hamilton College study which found that 35.6% of female respondents wore the hijab daily. So that's a lot higher. I mean, you might say, well, that's overstated. You might say that relies on self-selection to a degree because they have to respond to the poll. But that's more than few, if any. So that's just something to start out with in the beginning. So, moving on to the hijab itself. So we've talked a little bit about it. We've talked about its use. We'll talk about it itself. You know, hijab comes from the Arabic root hajaba, meaning to screen, cover, conceal. It comes from the first stem of the root. And in the Quran itself, we do not have hijab as an item of clothing referred to. In several surah of the Quran, for example, Al-Araf, verse 7, Al-Isra 17, Maryam 19, we have hijab used in the sense of a screen or a veil of sort of a division. Just to give you a brief example, Yusuf Ali translation of Al-Isra 17, ayah 45, it says, when thou dost recite the Quran, we put between those and those who believe not in the hereafter a veil invisible. However, there are obviously surahs in the Quran that do refer to the practice of modesty in general and to female modesty in particular. Typically the ones most referred to, Surah An-Nur, especially line 31, and Surah Al-Azhar, line 59. This brings us to something that we're going to talk about a little more. In the words of James Smith, a scholar from Columbia, the Quran, despite what some Muslim women seem to think, does not actually specify how much of the body has to be covered. It's not an issue, as with so many other issues in the language of the Quran itself, which is at one and the same time very sort of sparse and concise, but at the same time packed with meaning, a difficult language to sort of unpack and understand. This issue is all the more important. So, we have, well, we'll turn to that in a minute, but that's the basis. So to give you just the background on the hijab and the use of the related word in the Quran. So what are we talking about to take sort of a broader step here? Basic terms and gradations. One of the issues you find when you talk about female clothing is that it often blurs into another, and especially in the form of the clothing and the way that Muslims themselves, especially American Muslims, will talk about it. First we have the hijab. Sort of the minimal form of the hijab would be a simple headscarf, you know, simple kerchief. As a matter of fact, as you might have seen many older American women wearing a few decades ago, or for example, traditional maybe Italian women wearing a few decades ago. So that's sort of the lesser form of the hijab. You can see more elaborate forms of the hijab in which there's a shaila, in which there's a long sort of drapery of it that goes down the back. There's also the kumur. So you can have more expansive forms of it. But in general, in sort of popular discourse, hijab is used, albeit not very accurately, sort of to refer to female Islamic clothing in general. Now you'll see a debate, for example, over our next term. Well, we'll get to that in 1 second, excuse me. Then there's the khimar. The origin of the khimar is referred to Surah 24, where it says that they should draw their clothing, in Yusuf Ali's translations, over their bosoms. All right? So in practical terms, if we want to make a gradation between hijab and khimar, with the khimar we have much more elaborate form, sort of like an extended nun's habit that's going to go down, cover the upper torso, some cases cover the upper arms as well. Then finally there's niqab, which is a face veil. Two forms. There's a half face, what's called the half niqab, which is an independent veil that's attached to the face. Then there's what's called the full, or you'll see on Islamic clothing sites, Gulf style niqab, which is often attached to an abaya, so it becomes sort of one large flowing garment that covers the entire body and leaves only the eyes visible. As I said, terms aren't really used accurately. For example, people say hijab when they're talking about a news article in which it's debated if a woman should enter the airport, for example, wearing niqab. You'll also see many Muslims, actually, in my study interviewees, who were Muslims or of Arabic background, would use the word burqa. Burqa obviously comes from South Asia. In its most extreme form, although there's some like Omani forms that refer to specific face masks that are used by different ethnicities, most extreme form, the burqa is almost like a lampshade or sort of a tubular covering that goes over the entire body like a tent. However, in my conversations with my interviewees, I often heard the term burqa used to refer to niqab with abaya, for example. So when American Muslims themselves, probably I would say, are influenced by the media, you know, influenced by, you know, the quote-unquote war on terror and events in Afghanistan. We hear the word burqa, burqa, burqa. So when they talk about it, they're not saying, you know, they're not saying niqab with abaya. They're saying, even though they're Muslims, even though in some cases they're Arabs, they're saying burqa. So, history of the hijab. Obviously, forms of veiling and female head covering go far back in civilization. The earliest time we see these are in Mesopotamia. There's some evidence for Vedic civilization, but the hard dating on that's a little more complicated. Now, in Mesopotamia, where we see it among sacred prostitutes and high-priced courtesans, is where we see it. So initially, there's no concept of the veil or female head covering or concealment being connected to modesty in and of itself. And you can say, your obvious response is, Steve, you know, what does that have to do, if it's 3,000 years before Islam, with how the veil is used in Islam? Well, the key word here, there's a couple of key words you'll hear me repeat again and again. Status. Is the veil is a sign of status. It's a sign for the temple prostitute that she belongs to the god, and for the high-priced courtesan, it's a sign of status in that you don't get to look at the goods for free, more or less. Corinth, we have the classical accounts of the temple prostitutes wearing veils and head coverings. We find in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, Judah, the son of Israel, he goes out on the road, I guess looking for a good time, you could say, and Tamar, who unbeknownst to him is his daughter-in-law, is trying to become pregnant so she doesn't become a single widow on her own. And it says, when Judah saw Tamar, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Now realizing she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." Now again, let me remind you, we say prostitute, probably not an exact translation, especially with the connotations we have of prostitution today, meaning streetwalker. It means someone who is set aside in terms of status. These debates are incredibly relevant today. Recently, well actually I should say a few years back in Turkey, to quote an article, a 92-year-old woman, the famous Mesopotamian archaeologist, Muazzez Emilia Sig, was prosecuted for inciting religious hatred. And her specific crime was that in a book she wrote on Sumerian civilization, she said that the Islamic headscarf actually originated in Sumer as a designation for sacralized temple prostitutes. So these themes are alive. But what do we see again and again? Status. It's not about modesty, it's not about morality, it's about a setting apart. So, moving into Islamic times, we turn to the Hadith. There's much evidence in the Hadith that the hijab, meaning only sort of a head covering, is preferable and that the niqab is not mandatory. We'll talk about this a little later, time permitting. But for example, there's many indications in Hadith where it says a woman with a mole on her cheek came up to speak to Muhammad. And you say, well, how could she have had a mole on her cheek and everyone saw it if she was wearing a full, entire face veil? There's also a hadith in which a woman is praying, and it says the men try to look at her because she's so beautiful. Obviously, once again, how could she be wearing a full face veil? So then we come to the issue of veiling and dress itself in connection with the wives of Muhammad. And it's interesting because there's some Muslims today who are starting to specifically focus on this, is that the Institute of Veiling, or a lot of these institutes of Islamic dress, began with the wives of Muhammad in particular. Just to give you a quick quote from Sahih Bukhari, it says the Prophet stayed with Safiya bin Huyay for 3 days on the way to Khaybar, where he consummated his marriage with her. Safiya was amongst those who was ordered to wear the veil. Narrated Umar, I said, O Allah's apostle, good and bad persons enter upon you, so I suggest that you order the mother of believers, i.e. your wives, to observe veils. It says, then Allah revealed the verses of Al-Hijab. Now what's really interesting about this is that when you go online, when you go to the Islamic sites that people use, especially new Muslims, Muslims returning to Islam, you find that there's complete interpolations in these hadiths that are simply not there in the Arabic. For one example, when there's an incident when Sauda, one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, is recognized as she goes out to answer the call of nature. And it says, she did this after it was made obligatory, and on the site it says, parentheses, for all the Muslims, ladies, to observe the veil. So we have a direct interpolation in there that someone's going to be led to think, if they're reading this for the first time, that is part of the hadith itself. There's another example, for example, well, let me move on, I don't want to do too many examples here, we can return to them time permitting. So, Muhammad for the Muslim is clearly the best of men. You know, as some say, this hadith, he's a living Quran, he's an example of emulation. So, we can't simply say, it would be too cynical, it would sort of be anachronistic to say, well, Muslims just imitated what was done by his wives because it was an issue of status. Status, piety, it's sort of a moot point here. But it did spread, and we do look when we find in Islamic history that this relation to status, that word I've talked about before, continues to go on. For example, we then have the Umayyad dynasty. We have the Umayyad dynasty heavily influenced by Iranian and Greek court culture. So we begin to see the emphasis of this Indo-Mediterranean, to use Hodgins' term, form of the veil that does not exactly equate with what we find in the original Islamic source documents. On a side note, an interesting point I found is that in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the first time a physical partition was introduced into the mosque to separate worshippers from each other was not done to separate men and women. Scott, you want to take a guess as to who it was done to separate?
I don't know.
Anybody?
The caliph.
Very good. It was done to separate the ruler from the common folk. So what do we see once again? Status coming up once again, because today you find the partition in the mosque separating men and women. You look back, it was done to separate originally, and was incidentally heavily criticized by scholars, contemporary scholars, to separate the ruler and his entourage from the common people. So in the recent past, we have the issue of agrarian labor. We don't see, especially the more elaborate forms of Islamic dress, sometimes even just hijab and khimar, worn by women in many countries. Why? Because if you're an agrarian society, you live in an agrarian society, and you're out laboring in the fields, some of these more cumbersome forms, you know, a long flowing robe, are not going to facilitate your working in the field. So that's something that comes into play as well. It's just simply not functional. In addition, if you're living in a small village community, most of the people around you are probably members of your extended family. So you're not technically exposing, while they might not be mahram, all of them to you, you're not technically exposing yourself to strangers. So I was reminded when I read of this detail of reformers, you know, sort of the Benthamists and the reformers in 19th century England who went into the coal mines, and they were shocked and horrified because women were working topless in the coal mines. They said this is immoral, this is outrageous. Well, the reason they were working topless is because it was about 130 degrees, number one, and number two, because they were working, once again, among their extended families. In recent times, Smith goes as far as to claim that the uprising in the use of the hijab is due primarily to the Nakba, to the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. That's when we really begin to see an upswing in its use. However, as I suggested earlier, other incidents keep bringing it up and tend to emphasize it more. To quote Sajida Kadi, a Muslim activist in Toronto, she said that she attributed the increasing observance of hijab to the war in the Persian Gulf itself. So we have Muslims themselves that are saying, when these things happen, we want to assert a common identity. So, the hijab today, well, basically you'll find an Islamic consensus on the nature of the hijab. Most people agree that some form of head covering is mandatory for women after puberty. However, the exact forms of it, to what degree, and exactly when it begins, are still issues of debate and tension. There's also an issue concerning forms of dress. Is a full abaya required, or is a woman able to dress in conservative or modest Western dress? Oftentimes people will cite the rule, they'll say, well, the dress of a woman should not resemble a man. Well, does that mean that a woman can't wear pants? Because in Western society, pants are pretty much a unisex garment. Some will say yes, some will say no. So, moving on to some conflicts, Canada recently had a conflict over the use of the hijab in which you saw really the lines of conflict brought to the forefront. And one of the themes that constantly come up, I should say, is sort of feminist, secularist Muslim antagonism. To quote one Canadian feminist, she wrote actually an op-ed piece which said, "It's one thing to see covered faces as the exotic and mysterious product of another culture you can leave behind, but quite another to see them on your, quote, home turf." All right? And Shakiri wrote an excellent article on the Canadian hijab controversy and Muslims on the Americanization path, quotes a Harvard-educated chemist wearing hijab who says, "So long as our choice agrees with the prevailing Western paradigm, it is valid, but if our choice is contrary to what intellectuals are comfortable with, it's not a real choice." So basically what we see is that people, those secularists and liberalists who are often the strongest proponents of multiculturalism, find themselves stymied by adherence to the hijab. They find themselves forced to confront presuppositions that exist beneath sort of the veneer of liberalism in a quote-unquote pluralistic society. And this issue is brought up in the community. So, conflicts within the Muslim community. One of the strongest, I wouldn't say strongest might be an exaggeration, but in terms of people who are concerned and read such things that goes on now, is hijab versus niqab. And often this is tied into the Salafi-Ikhwani divide. Salafis will be saying that full niqab is necessary, and they'll interpret the verses in a particular way, where Ikhwanians or the more progressive reformists will say, no, hijab itself is what mandatory. In my own study, none of the women I interviewed wore niqab. And you could say, well, obviously, that's based on self-selection. None of them were talked to in the first place. However, during my time at the ISB, I never did observe any women wearing niqab, which could have been due to the Ikhwani influence, but I still think it's a relatively rare phenomenon in the United States. However, there's a good suggestion that it is on the rise. And what I say that on is not only news accounts where we find controversy over women wearing the full face veil, but also in a lot of these online Islamic sites where there's forums and discussions and you can go for a fatwa. We say, my husband wants me to wear the niqab. We say, my brother says that I should wear the niqab. So it's something that is starting to become more of an issue. You also have an ethnic traditional divide when it comes to the issues addressed. For example, one of my interviewees who was a member of the ISB, chose to wear the Egyptian, sort of the conservative, some people have referred to as the rich peasant form of a khimar and an abaya, and she said, without veiling her face, and she said that this is the best form of Islamic dress. She got into an argument, sort of a strong argument with an older aunt of hers who said, Pakistani dress is the most Islamic dress there is. So yeah, that's what I'm talking about when I say sort of religion versus tradition and Islam versus culture, is you have people saying, well, this is what Islam is because this is what us Muslims do, and then you have other people who are saying, no, this is what it's really supposed to be. Then, one other point of conflict we have is older immigrant cohorts. Cohort meaning sort of wave. We have a lot of the Muslims who first arrived in the United States, what's known as a pioneer wave at the turn of the century, were from the Levant, were from Lebanon, were from agrarian societies where especially the hijab was not often a form of dress. And when they came over to the United States due to limited contact with the home country after immigration, and also due to lack of institutionalized Islamic resources over here, there was a strong degree of assimilation. So in many mosques now, we see a conflict. In some cases, there's even just a division where you have these old descendants of older immigrants, typically from Lebanon and Syria. You have more recent immigrants from, let's say, Egypt or Pakistan, and they go their own ways. And one of the flashpoints often is the hijab. And it goes both directions. It's not just, radical new immigrants that are demanding things. To give you an example from Abu Laban, she quotes one woman who says, I hate it when they see those scarves. They make people look so ignorant. And then even an elderly woman comments, they were attending our meeting, meaning the women's meeting at the mosque, with that thing tied around their heads. So it's a lot of controversy there. So moving on a little bit, stereotypes within and without the community, expectations of hijabi women. Surprisingly, there do exist, or perhaps not surprisingly, stereotypes within the community itself. For example, one woman, one of my interviewees said, she has a hard time sometimes meeting marriage partners because she wears hijab, and a recent immigrant, for example, who might want to be her husband thinks, oh, she wears hijab, she's Muslim, she's working for Islam, I should say, and therefore often he assumes that she'll be very traditional, or she'll be very submissive in her attitude. So the Muslims themselves can often miss the point. Then we often have within the community attitudes towards non-hijabis. There's an excellent article online that quotes the work of Jamal Badawi, one of the leaders of the North American Fiqh Council and often a speaker at the ISB, where he says, while it is correct to say that hijab is correct in the teaching of Islam, we tend to forget there are many other basic issues. Why this over-obsession? You know, again, it goes back to visibility. It goes back to concepts of group identity, where we see sort of an over-focus on it. And people have frankly recognized that this is a barrier often for converts to Islam, and often for Muslims returning to Islam. You get a lot of narratives where people try to go to a mosque because they're interested in converting, and if it's a woman, they may be literally chased out if they're not appropriately dressed. Now, getting near the end, hate crimes. I found this particularly interesting. And I was interested in the antagonistic reaction of Americans to the hijab. One of the resources I relied upon that they were very helpful to me in getting it to me was a report on crimes against Muslims after 9/11 by the Maine Center for Hate Crime Prevention. And they said that hijabi women are particularly vulnerable to hate crimes. Well, what do we see when we look at these crimes? I won't go into all the details. We can talk about it more in the discussion period. But I found that they kind of, again, to stress this is very preliminary, but they really seem to fall along two different axes when you look at the perpetrators. I was obviously interested in the crimes themselves, but I was interested in the identity of the perpetrators of these crimes. And the most basic difference I could find in the hate crimes, attacks on hijabis, were literally those carried out by men and those carried out by women. And I think there's a very suggestive trend, again, footnote that this is preliminary, but with males, you have one category, I think, of hate crimes where it's sort of a blitz style. You know, someone spat on, the hijab's ripped from their head, they're struck, you know, they're knocked down, they're sworn at. It's blitz style. And usually it's carried out by a working class white male. This is what I call sort of the Neanderthal version of the hate crime attack. But then you have this other category carried out by women. It happens a lot. Just to give you two real quick examples, one woman who was confronted was a Harvard student. Actually, it's been several Harvard students who've dealt with this in particular. She was screaming and mobbed by women, by a group of women in their mid-40s, and they were screaming, "Filthy Jew hater." There's another incident where an Iranian immigrant was assaulted in Harvard Square by 5 women. We have Katie O'Day, Mary Ellen O'Day, and then we have Lynn Bowman, Laura Schneider, and Alina Rakoski. You see something different. My own interviewees talked about the prejudice they had faced in institutional settings. Not from men so much, but from women. So what does that say? That's very suggestive about female competition, you know, female sexuality in the modern context. Another example I can give you, one of my interviewers who wears hijab was in the CVS in Norwood, when a well-dressed middle-class woman, it was near Halloween, she said, "Well, today you have your costume on, it suits you." So there's definitely a trend, I think, that you can notice in these attacks. The female ones, it's more directed at sort of the discreditedness. So male, it's a blitz attack, she's foreign, she doesn't belong here, but the female, it's you're a Jew hater, you know? You're undermining feminism. To quote one of those women from the Canadian controversy, we had, you can't get more visceral literally than this. The feminist said, "Every time I see one of these women, I feel like I've been punched in the stomach." And it's funny, and I know this sounds a little paradoxical, but the female hate crimes are actually much more confrontational. They're much more verbal, they're much more interacting with the person, where the male hate crime is throwing the beer bottle out the window. So that's an interesting trend. All right, so I've got some narratives here. We can go into them more, you know, if you want to in the discussion session. We'll make time, meaning I'll make the allotted time. But what I found, some interesting things I found is even those of my interviewees who didn't wear the hijab would wear one inside the mosque. Now, Haddad and Loomis and other authors say that this actually used to be pretty much standard practice in the United States. But what I found is I think this is changing, because with Islamism, Islamic revival, so many of my interviewees, the views they took, it emphasizes intention, sincerity, purity. So purity of intention. So women actually, even without external constraint, are often uncomfortable switching back and forth. I asked one of my interviewees, she said she would always travel to Egypt as a youngster from the United States and she didn't wear hijab even as a teenager. She does now as an adult. I said, why didn't you wear the hijab when you went to Egypt? Her exact response was, I didn't want to be in between. So that's a very interesting response. It's saying that this issue in a way is taken so seriously that we would, I think it would be a good prediction, tend to see less and less of this trend of switching back and forth, of wearing it in services, wearing it in prayers, and not wearing it during daily life. Interestingly enough, folks, that's what we find from the surveys as well. When you look at things like the Hamilton College study, you have those who wear the hijab daily, and those who never wear it. You don't have a bell curve. What you have is you have a spike here, and you have a spike there. So in other words, there's not a few days a week, there's not off and on, there is a polarization that happens there. So, let's see, some more interesting stuff, but just to make sure I fit the time requirements. Limits of my interviewees. So one of the things that did, I wouldn't say bother me, but that I was well aware of, is especially Professor Lindholm addressing in his opening remarks, the nature of the ISB. Was founded originally by college students at MIT. Then it grew to be an organization for Muslims in the surrounding area. And although it serves many different ethnicities, and although there's many different types of people there, for example, if you go on Friday prayers, you'll see every taxi in Cambridge trying to fit into the parking lot. So there are different classes there. However, most of my interviewees were educated, very educated, and I would say there's no other concept to say it but bourgeois. So that was something I was thinking about. I was saying, okay, so this is obviously a limitation here. Let's go beyond it. Now, I was interested into these class issues, and here for the last part, we get to the work part. We talked somewhat about the sex, but we get to the work part of the economic and educational issues of wearing hijab. Well, there was an excellent study done by Prasad and Lucas in 2002, which talks about, it's called No Hijab is Permitted Here. And it was a specific study done on women working in retail, marketing, and low-end jobs and low-end labor. And what it found was they encountered incredible resistance to wearing the hijab. You know, Dunkin' Donuts, you know, we're in Massachusetts here, we know there's a Dunkin' Donuts every block, right? Dunkin' Donuts was one specific culprit, you know. Walmart, McDonald's, places like this. I'll give you an example. It says, I applied at a fast food store. The manager told me he didn't think I could do the job because my dressing is different. I said, okay, I'll wear a full sleeve shirt and hijab. And he said, no, I don't think you'll do this job. I applied at another store and they didn't call me. It's because I gave a photo in which I was wearing hijab. So this raises a lot of issues for us. Now, it would be kind of cynical to say that my interviewees who were, that means we're almost done, my interviewees who were educated, basically they were either academics and professionals themselves or full-time housewives, and were able to be full-time housewives because their husband was an academic or a professional. It would be somewhat cynical to say that they have the luxury of wearing the hijab. But there is some truth to it, you know? Because when we look at women, like I said, who, if you're a poor Muslim woman and you have to work in the service sector, not only are you going to encounter a lot more ignorance, but you're also going to encounter, you're also going to have on your own part a lack of access to resources. So, for example, one of my interviewees said, a male, he said that whenever he applies for a job, you know, he always lists for, like, you know, life accomplishments, you know, work for the Muslim American Society, lead the local Muslim scout troop, because he said, you know, if I'm not, if they don't want me to, they don't want to hire a Muslim, I want them to know that I'm a Muslim, so they don't hire me. But he said at the job, he actually told some funny, very funny stories. He said, well, they bend over backwards, he works at a software company, because they're afraid of First Amendment issues and they're afraid of litigation. So he said one day, I need a place to pray. And the entire whole office was thrown into disarray as the vice president and everyone ran around the building trying to secure him a sufficient prayer room. But compare that, like I said, to a woman working at Dunkin' Donuts or a woman working in a factory. They're going to be in a totally different environment. And what compounds this is if you have especially a poor immigrant woman, she herself may not be aware of her own rights in the American environment. So what happens? IslamOnline.net was a site frequently referred to by my interviewees, and there's a sort of a fatwa on there from Sheikh Ahmad Kudi, Canadian Islamic scholar that many at the ISB refer to, and Muslims sort of that, what I would call mainstream conservatives. And she says, my boss says that I can't wear the hijab at work. You know, is it okay if I wear it to work and don't wear it to work and I take it off after work? And he says, no, this is completely unacceptable. You are not accountable to anyone but Allah, and you must do what Allah says. He does give her the number for the Council on American Islamic Relations. He says you have religious rights in the First Amendment and these different things. But you have to think to yourself, first of all, if this woman is working and she's working outside the home, that in itself may be a disincentive for her to even approach people to help, you know? She runs the risk if she lives in a conservative community of if she has this problem, people are going to say, why are you working anyway? Why are you outside the house in the first place if it's a relatively conservative community? The second thing is, if she's working, chances are her family's depending on the paycheck. And if they're depending on the paycheck, sure, we can go to the ACLU, we can go to CARE, we can go to these different groups. How long will they take to act? And what's she supposed to do in the interim? Now, among my interviewees, the classic response to questions like this was zakat. There was like, you're homeless, zakat. You can't work in a fast food place because they all serve pork or they don't serve halal meat. You have no job. What do? Zakat. That's what zakat is for. That's zakat. Right. But nothing in life is free. And so even if we have a hypothetical situation in which economic demands prevented a woman from working due to the hijab, and you can say, well, zakat, she can rely on the local community. Is a Somalian woman who's forced to work and who doesn't want to be working in the first place, is kind of ashamed of it, is she going to go to the Pakistani-controlled mosque and walk in there and ask for money? Maybe. Happens sometimes. But will she necessarily do that? I actually have a very close personal friend who, due to the nature of the social service they work in, works extensively with the Somalian community out in western Massachusetts. And some of those people were here for years and literally never knew there was a mosque 3 or 4 blocks away. So that's something you run into. Plus you run into the idea of if you're accepting something for someone, there's an obvious concept of indebtedness. And so even if zakat is sort of the easy panacea for these economic problems such as this, there's going to be expected that there's more. So for my one final remark, something that comes up often, I found, was intergenerational struggle with the hijab. As my interviewees told me, often you see the daughter wear it before the mother. In these days, it's more and more true. So, and oftentimes, you see opposition. You see opposition from parents to their daughters. So in contrary to the Western stereotype that this is the families are brainwashing them and this is something forced on by quote-unquote traditional parents, it's something the woman does. One of my interviewees said, frankly, she said, well, my parents didn't want me to wear it around my cousins because they said they'd never be able to get me married. So they don't want this to happen. And there's even cases from the literature in which, one I found particularly striking, in which mothers have demanded that their daughters wear the hijab, remove the hijab before they get married. I mean, it's clearly symbolic. And as one, Abu al-Fadl, one scholar writes, he says, parents who demand the right to uncover their children's bodies, i.e. to control their sexuality, their conjugal relationships, are not going to want those children to have the right to cover their own bodies. Whereas from an outside perspective, say, oh, it's just conservatism, you know? So when the female Muslim, in the context of an Islamist group, in the context of revival, wears a hijab, she's actually asserting self-control in many ways. And to quote my interviewees, no one is forced to wear it, even especially in the American environment and even abroad. And you see cases in the news where there's 4 or 5-year-old girls participating in some athletic event and they're wearing a hijab, and you say, well, she's not choosing to wear it. But listen to what those parents say. And what is the reason they give? They say, we have to get her used to it. Why do they have to get her used to it? Because they know that eventually, at some point, they can't force her to do it. So even that strategy with the children implicitly, if not explicitly, acknowledges the role of choice. All right? So that's the central part of my talk. I'm very happy to have a question and answer session, but hopefully I managed to stick to the time, more or less.
Thanks, Steve.